Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are thinking a lot about what's happening in the recycling industry as the COVID-19 pandemic progresses. We know it's no secret that the world is locked down, but what we've seen in reports is that residential recycling is actually up in many places where people are staying at home, cleaning the house, and sending materials through the system. On the other hand, business recycling has almost completely collapsed. And we wanted to find out how that's going to impact the future of the recycling system in the United States. So we invited Joe Pickard, who is the chief economist at the Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries. Joe, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're glad you're well. It's time to be well. Joe, this has been a remarkable time, and I refer to this as the great pause, and we're hoping it's a pause in which people stop and reflect on how we might also improve systems, not merely return to something that was the old normal. Can you tell us in very broad terms what the state of the industry is right now, given all of the changes we've gone through over the last 2 months?
Yeah, I think, and thanks again for having me on today. I think as with so many other industries across the United States, this has been obviously a shock to the system for the recycling industry as well. And so we're seeing a lot of transition in terms of on the municipal side of the business, in terms of MRF operations, but also on the private sector side of the business in terms of the flow of obsolete scrap into scrap yards, but also what's happening on the manufacturing front, because as you probably know, most of the recyclables that get processed in this country are sold to domestic manufacturers.
Right.
So the health of the manufacturing industry is also extremely important with respect to the health of the recycling industry. So there are a lot of things in flux, obviously, and market conditions were challenging to begin with before the COVID-19 pandemic began. And so they've become even more complicated, I think, as a result of it. But happy to talk more about the individual market dynamics as you wish.
Well, so I think at the individual market level, in terms of any particular material, we've seen a lot of programs close and then start to reopen, and in some cases reopen completely. Do you have a sense right now, just the percentage of the industry, say around scrap metal, that is active, or are we down, as in the manufacturing sector, by as much as 40 to 50%?
Yeah, most of it's anecdotal. We don't have hard data in terms of sort of capacity utilization rates, especially on the scrap metal side. But we do have reports, and I think they probably track pretty closely with the manufacturing side of the business. For example, if you look at the steel mill capacity utilization rate, this time last year it was over 81%. Currently, we're looking at 55 to 56%. And I think what you hear from a lot of the scrap yards are similar numbers because we've had a reduced flow of obsolete scrap because some of the scrap yards have curtailed or stopped some of their retail operations. Mm-hmm. But also they're getting less prime scrap generated from the manufacturers. If you look at the MRF side of the equation, there's been a real shift in supply as well, like you alluded to. Some MRFs have had to either stop their operations or curtail their operations or change the stream of material that they're accepting. That's starting to loosen up a little bit, but it has meant that the flow has shifted more towards the residential side of the business, certainly, and away from the commercial collections. And I think that's emphasized just how important the residential supply is. And just for a second, if you think about it from an end product perspective, people are certainly, in the market for paper and paper products, whether that's, toilet paper or napkins or
more than ever.
Yeah, exactly. But in order to produce those products, there needs to be a flow of raw material inputs that the paper mills can use. And so it's an interconnected system where the recycling that comes to the residential stream is extremely important to supplying the recycled content for the paper mills to make those products that the consumers are relying on.
So let me back up a bit and just add a couple of pieces of context here. So you mentioned MRFs, and for folks listening who aren't familiar with that phrase, it's MRF and pronounced MRF, and it means Materials Recovery Facility. These are the large sorting facilities that are often co-located with big transfer stations. The other thing is ISRI, and you can go to ISRI.org in order to take a look at what they are providing right now in terms of guidance about worker safety and your safety as a recycler is really important to understand. Not, just as the delivery drivers who are bringing packages to our homes are now using contact-free delivery, these drivers often have to think about the handling of either the paperwork or the device that they hand to a customer when they're picking up a load or when they're dropping off that load at a buyer. So there's a lot of the same kind of dynamics that we see in the delivery industry that with regard to worker safety that people need to be concerned about. And ISRI has excellent guides about thinking about all of those things. If you're concerned about the safety of your recycling workers, it's a good thing to take a look at. Now, Joe, how long do you think this takes to come back? And do you think that there are certain types of recycling companies that are better positioned to survive the downturn that we are in?
Yeah, it's certainly a downturn, right? And so that's a big part of the uncertainty going forward. We saw that the economy contracted 4.8% in the first quarter of this year. The expectation is that in the second quarter, the economy contracted anywhere from 20 to 40%. Mm-hmm. And then the other complicating factor is on the health front, right? And there's so much uncertainty in terms of the spread of the coronavirus and when that's going to allow companies to get back to some semblance of normality. But I think the expectation is certainly the second quarter is going to continue to be difficult. I think looking out a little bit further, regardless of when the economic growth resumes, there's going to be an increased emphasis on worker safety, on social distancing, on having the protective equipment that workers need to perform their jobs safely. And that's not probably going to change anytime soon.
And what about the types of companies within the recycling industry that are better positioned or more at risk because of the way that they've operated in the past? Do you have any insights into what kind of companies are more prepared to survive?
Yeah, I think, anytime you're dealing with an economic downturn, cash flow becomes increasingly important. So companies that have access to credit that had positive cash flow to begin with certainly are better positioned. But it also varies a good bit by commodity and by type of business. So for example, by commodity, we've seen so much fluctuation in energy market prices, for example, the price of oil, that really complicates the situation for plastic scrap recyclers because as oil and energy prices become extremely inexpensive, that also makes it inexpensive to produce primary resin, which sort of disincentivizes the use of plastics. Right. So I think as you continue to see volatility within the energy markets, plastic scrap recyclers are facing especially challenging market conditions. If you look at some of the other commodities like paper, electronics, and the ferrous and non-ferrous metals, they all have their own specific market dynamics. But again, I think the companies that have prepared themselves in advance, especially with regard to their financing, will be better suited to weather this downturn.
It's interesting that the potential resurgence of oil because of its remarkable drop in price is something that all environmentally minded folks need to be painfully aware of. That we're ultimately going to end up burning a lot more oil than we might have if we had continued the way life was before. As you look at this as an economist, the oil market is in a glut situation. It's so overwhelmed right now that there's nowhere to store all this material. How long, based on your understanding of market dynamics, do you think it takes for oil to start to recover to a point where we might not see it as a competitor to more sustainably minded approaches?
That's also an excellent question that I don't really have the answer to, but I'll tell you my perspective on it. And that's that the problem with the oil markets right now is there continues to be excess production with respect to the amount of demand globally. And because there's been such a downturn in demand for oil and energy products, for example, over the last 6 weeks, I think I've put gas into my car maybe once. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat. We're just not consuming as much oil and gas because we're not out and about, and the economy has been, locked down for some time. So given that, the expectation is that there's going to continue to be a shortfall in terms of demand because of the economic crunch that we're facing right now. And so the outlook for oil, unfortunately, is not positive in the near term. And I think it's, you just look at the NYMEX May contract, which had turned negative right before the expiration of the contract because there was no place to put the oil. And so that's not a great indicator of a healthy market balance going forward.
Yeah, in fact, it actually was, that contract went almost $40 below $0. In other words, people were paying $40 to store the barrel of oil that they were purchasing if they in fact did that. We've never seen anything like this before.
Yeah.
Let's also turn to, we've heard a lot about stimulus programs and economic recovery programs. Is Congress looking at anything to restore a robust recycling system in the United States, or is that something that isn't on the table right now?
I think it's potentially on the table. I think a lot of the difference between the last Great Recession and the economic downturn we're facing right now is the speed with which stimulus measures have been introduced into the economy, both fiscal stimulus, like the Small Business Administration programs, the Paycheck Protection Program, but also the monetary stimulus that the Federal Reserve is entering into the economy now. And so I think those stimulus measures are quite beneficial to the recycling industry and to small businesses generally. Certainly there's been some problems administering some of these programs, but the sum total, when you're looking at trillions and trillions of dollars that are being made available to support industry, I think is beneficial not just to recyclers, but to the manufacturing base in the United States generally.
That's great to hear. Is there any legislation people should be paying attention to in terms of support for recycling?
I don't know of anything currently that they need to be paying attention to, but I think there is a lot of attention, and rightly so, I think, that's been placed on the health of the recycling industry. And I think that was in the works even before the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was increased public attention, media attention, and attention from policymakers to make sure that the viability of the recycling industry was promoted. And certainly ISRI's been at the forefront of promoting those efforts.
And one last question with regard to the impact of the shutdown, and that is, we have traditionally sent immense amounts of scrap overseas to be processed, and then it's turned into new materials or new products and sent back to us. Do you see more potential for a domestic processing industry in the wake of the sort of internationalization or deglobalization of this of the world?
I think there's been a lot of focus in terms of sort of reshoring of manufacturing within the United States, which tends to be positively correlated with demand for scrap, which is a positive. In terms of the global marketplace for scrap, I think there's always going to be the international trade of recyclable commodities, because recyclables are going to go to where they're needed most. But I would also say that there's been, at least prior to the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, there's been increased interest in investment in the U.S. recycling space. I think both in terms of, domestic investment, but also foreign direct investment, to make sure that the recyclables that our industry is processing meet the quality demands of consumers. And so I think you're going to continue to see an emphasis on producing the highest quality recyclable packages. And I think that's going to be a positive for our industry going forward.
Well, and my last question for you is just based on where we are and recognizing that where we are is a situation in which we cannot really predict much of anything because we have literally never seen this before. How long does recycling, the industry, the companies, the workers need to recover from this, to return to something approximating what we thought of as a normal? And I know that's a very hard question to answer, but what's your take?
It's a difficult question for sure, and I'm not sure that we return to the normal that we knew before, as you've heard, from other sectors of the economy, just because of the increased emphasis on health and safety, and the uncertainty in terms of public health with the spread of the coronavirus. But I think looking forward, the outlook is actually quite positive for the recycling industry. We're all going through this difficult period right now. But I think, in the medium to longer term, there's going to be an increased emphasis on the sustainability of raw material supply to meet our manufacturing needs. And I think that's a definite positive for the industry. In terms of what the new normal looks like, that's an open question, I think, that we're all trying to address going forward.
Well, to me, it's encouraging to look back on the Depression, which is a strange thing to say, obviously,
right.
And see that many of the most prominent companies in the United States that we're widely familiar with, the brands that we know and trust, emerged during the Depression and during other major downturns. So this is an opportunity for a lot of innovation, and it's encouraging to hear that there's greater interest both from domestic and foreign investors in making our recycling system work better. Thank you very much for sharing this information with us.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, Joe Pickard, the chief economist at ISRI, that's the Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries. Thanks very much for joining us. And by the way, just a matter of disclosure, Earth911 is a member of ISRI, and I want you all to know that. We try to ask honest and straightforward questions, but we also want to be transparent. So thanks, folks, for joining us on Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care, be safe, be well.